Today I'm coming back at you with another Get That Sound video. So for this one we're going to be tackling the lush pad sound in the song One Perfect Touch by Villem. Now this is a liquid drum and bass song and it just came out this year. It's a pretty recent song, but the thing I love about it is that it harkens back to that 90s liquid drum and bass jungle stuff that I personally really love. Now the sound we'll be recreating, we'll be using Anna 2 to do it, and we'll be using the Chord Memory Device to stack the sound into a parallel harmony chord. The sound itself has a feeling like it got a bit of a sound like it might be sampled or something like that, which is a common technique used in drum and bass, sampling chords from other records, or even just sampling chords from romplers and different synthesizers, then putting them into samplers and playing different notes on the keyboard to achieve this kind of parallel harmony effect. So we'll do something similar with Anna 2. We'll talk about the oscillators we're using and the detuning settings, filtering settings, obviously all of that stuff. So we'll be doing it all in Anna 2. Let's go ahead and get started. I'll catch you in the tutorial. All right, everyone, as stated in the intro, we're going to be breaking down the lush pad sound that comes in during the drops of One Perfect Touch by Villem, one of my favorite modern drum and bass songs here. It's got a really nice modern liquid drum and bass sound. It's very clean, but it also harkens back to that vintage like 90s style of jungle and Liquid DnB that I personally really love. So we'll play a little bit of the song here. I've got about a 4-bar lead in, and then the sound that we're going to be analyzing and breaking down is coming in right here at bar 9 on my arrangement. So we'll start from the first 4 bars leading in. Here we get that nice pad. Now you can see if you look at my MIDI clip here, turn my loop brace on because we're going to be working in this loop. I've got just a drum loop, just a little fast drum and bass beat I put together there, and then our MIDI notes. So if you look at my MIDI notes, we're only playing one note at a time, but we're actually hearing chords. And if we look at the notes I'm playing, the song is in the scale of C minor. So if you use your scale isolation tool over here in the MIDI clip editor in Ableton Live, we can see the specific notes in the C minor scale. But we're working in a C minor scale. We're going to start on the C note. We're going to go down to a G note, which is the 5th scale degree. Then we're going to go up to a B flat, which is the 7th scale degree. And then we're going to go down to an F, which is the 4th scale degree. So we have this kind of 1, 5, 7, 4 thing going on. We're going to be creating a sort of a chord progression, but it's not a traditional chord progression. We're not going to get the exact notes that would be in a 1, 5, 7, 4 chord. There's a thing going on in this sound called parallel harmony, which is a feature in a lot of drum and bass, a lot of house music, a lot of techno, where producers would sample chords, and when you sample a chord, if you put it in a sampler and you play different notes, you're going to hear the same exact interval between all the notes. The only thing that's really changing is the root, and then the intervals between all the additional notes that you hear stay the same. That's called parallel harmony. We're going to recreate that in Anna 2 with the Chord Memory Device, so we'll give it this kind of vintage sampled sound. Even though we're only playing one note at a time, we'll turn it into a chord and give it that kind of vintage sampled sound, as I said. So let's go into Anna 2. And the sound in the reference song, it sounds to me a bit like it could be coming from a Roland, like a Juno or a Jupiter style synth. So you can actually see, let's reinitialize here. I was messing around with the different saw waveforms. It is a saw waveform. So if we go to the analog folder here, we can scroll down. There is actually a saw Jupiter. And you can see it's a sawtooth wave, but it's not so perfectly symmetrical and jagged. And that's going to give it a little bit of unique character, and that's why there are so many different iterations of saw waves that we can choose in here, different iterations of square waves, etc. So we'll go with that saw Jupiter, see what that sounds like. And we're going to start by detuning this. So it's got kind of like a super saw feel, right? So we're going to increase the number of voices here. Let's go up to about 7. If we're dealing with the Roland JP8000, for example, the super saw oscillator on that is 7 detuned saw waves. So we'll go to 7. And then we'll kind of adjust the detune settings. If you start with it all the way down, you just hear those 7 saw waves piled on top of each other and kind of phase canceling a little bit. But as we start to increase that, start to thicken the sound up a bit. The width parameter is already turned up on the oscillator, so we've got this nice wide stereo image. If you're listening in headphones, you should be able to hear that. Okay, let's get the chords here now, because that's really what's going to fill the sound out and make it feel more like it has this moody jungle drum and bass feel. So we'll use the Chord Memory Device. So we're going to go down here. Let's turn it on first. And we'll go down here, and what we need to do is tell Anna 2 which notes to trigger in addition to our root note. Now, the fact that the root note right now in this saved chord setting up here is C3 doesn't really matter. That doesn't mean it's going to lock what we play so that we only ever hear a C3. We're just telling it what intervals to add on top of whatever root note we play. So just imagine for a minute that C3 is our root note, and we are actually starting on C3 in our MIDI clip. But we're just going to tell it to play the minor third, which is going to be E flat. We're going to tell it to play the perfect fifth, which is going to be a G. So already if we play that, you can hear it's triggering these minor chords, parallel minor chords. If we look over here where it says chords, it tells us the chords that are being triggered. B flat minor, F minor, C minor, G minor, etc. Now we want to add some more intervals to this though. So we have our triad, our basic triad chord, root, minor third, perfect fifth. Now we want to add the minor 7, which is going to be G, A sharp or B flat. Starts to thicken the chord up a little bit. Oops, wrong one there. And then if we add a D note, that's going to give us a minor 9 interval. And you can see here now we have minor 9 chords, and that's what we're working with. That's what the sound in the song is, just playing these parallel minor 9 chords. If you want to give the sound a little bit more weight in the low end, what I sometimes like to do is add another note an octave below the root. So it's the same chord, we just have this additional low octave, just adding some weight to it. Maybe add a little bit of detuning. So let's pass it through the filter now. We've got the Chord Memory Device on. We can just leave it in single mode. We're pretty much good here. And just to recap, any note that we play, it's turning it into a minor 9 chord. So again, it's not just restricting it so we only hear C, right? We're clearly hearing other notes here. But whenever we play a new note, it's just adding these intervals on top of it, and then it's also adding this octave below it to thicken the sound up a bit. So, okay, let's pass it through the filter, like I said. So it's already going to filter number 1. Since I feel like this is a Roland style synth patch, let's use the Rolly filter, which is going to give us a low pass, nice low pass filter. I'm not going to use any of the master filter controls, so I'm going to turn this cutoff down. Already starts to sound pretty nice. But what we want to do is modulate this filter cutoff with the filter envelope. So what we're going to do is turn the envelope modulation amount up. This is indicating how much this filter envelope is going to move the filter cutoff. So what we want here is a little bit of attack time, and we actually want a little bit of attack time here on the amplitude envelope as well, just to give it a little bit of a fade in. Let's go maybe like 30 milliseconds, 60 milliseconds, double that. Actually, I want to go a little slower than that. 100 milliseconds, somewhere there. Okay, now let's go over to our filter envelope and let's dial this in. I want the sustain level to be higher because I want the sound, I want the cutoff to open up and then close back down, but just a little bit. And we're going to have a nice slow decay, which is going to cause it to close back down over a certain amount of time. We dial in that time with the decay setting here. If I turn the attack time up, it's taking longer to open the filter cutoff up to the right, so we get this kind of wah effect. We don't want too much of that, so we want a relatively fast attack here. But that nice slow decay to just sweep it down to a lower sustain level. Just adds a little movement to the sound. We could add a bit of filter drive. We don't need a whole lot here. We don't want to distort it too much. It's a pretty clean sound. Let's give our amp envelope a little bit of release time. Maybe like 3-ish seconds, 2 or 3 seconds. Let's try 3. Make sure your polyphony at 8. Let's actually increase the polyphony. We're playing how many notes in our Chord Memory Device here? We're hearing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 notes. So I usually like to double that if I'm going to be playing chords like this and adding release time. So let's set the polyphony up to 12. So if one chord ends, we hear the release time of all of those notes before the next chord, or when the next chord plays. We'll still hear the releases of all the notes in the first. And then by the time we get to that third one, it's cutting out the release times of the notes in the first chord, because at that point they've outstayed their welcome. We don't really need to hear those release tails overlapping that far. I might actually tighten the release time up a little bit now that I'm hearing this. It sounds nice though. It doesn't sound like any notes are cutting off too abruptly. Still get a decent tail to the sound. Let's jump down here to the effects. I might want to add a little bit of a send reverb. I actually like this plate reverb a lot that's on the send B here. So let's turn that on. Let's maybe bring the decay time up a little bit here. And then I can turn this send one level down, but this dry level here, think of this like the send level. We've created this sound, and if we turn this up, we're sending a copy of that dry signal into this effect. So it's just essentially putting a reverb on the sound, but we're doing it in parallel. Whereas normally if we go over to one of these insert effects, we have inserts 1 through 5. If we set up a reverb here and we turn that on, that would be using the effect as an insert, meaning that there would be a dry wet control that we could manipulate to kind of adjust the blend there. At the end of the day, it's going to get you more or less the same result, but using it as a send allows us to keep the full level of the dry and then just kind of add in a little reverb on top of that, rather than lose volume from the dry if we were to manipulate or turn a dry wet dial. So I still have my nice full dry signal. I'm just layering in just a little bit of this reverbed out wet signal. You can see that the plate reverb has the dry wet at 100% wet. We're only getting a parallel wet signal, affected signal from this. I'm just kind of tucking that in a little bit. This is the level of that. If I turn this up, we have now a full volume blend of both sounds. That's clearly too much. Okay, let's start to hear this with the drums. I want a little bit more attack time on both envelopes here. Just massage these attack times a little. Keep it a little faster on the filter envelope. I think I want a little slower on the amp envelope. There we go. Somewhere around 200 to 300 milliseconds. That's working nicely. Now, a couple of things just for added effect here. If you wanted to, you could use one of the multi-sampler oscillators over here to layer in a real string sample just to give it a little bit more of a realistic feel. So if we load this up, we go to the waveforms here. This allows us to, it's not actually waveforms, it's actually samples, audio samples. Let's search, because I know there's a string sample. Here we go, Ana 1 noise strings. Let's double click that. And if we want to hear that in isolation, we can go to the oscillator mix tab here and just solo it. So we hear that also going through the Chord MIDI device, so it's triggering those chords as well. That's nice, but it's a little high, so I may actually pitch the octave down. And I want this just to be tucked into the sound and layered with it, but I don't want it to steal the show, so I'm going to turn its volume down a little bit here. I want the volume on oscillator 1 to be a bit louder. Let's hear those together. And also, just to kind of keep this real string sample out of the way, we might high pass it a little bit. So this handy dandy high pass knob will just apply a high pass filter, removing the lows. So most of the low end is coming from this main saw wave, detuned saw waves here, and then that low note that we had on our Chord Memory Device, that low octave. You can kind of blend this into taste. You can do it from here using the volume dials. You can go to the oscillator mix window as well. Kind of like that. And barring maybe a few small tweaks to the the amp times, the amp envelope times, the attack and release, maybe the filter envelope times. We can go in and, perhaps play around with those. But we have the core sound here. One last thing I'm going to do here, I often like to add macro controls if there's a particular parameter that I think sounds good to move and maybe automate throughout the track. So this envelope amount, I think is really cool because we're determining, again, how much this filter envelope is opening the cutoff. So sometimes during the track, I may just want a little bit of that movement, but other times I might really want it to open up and really get the sound sounding really bright. In the song, Villem kind of keeps it in the same place. He doesn't really move that all that much, but that's a fun thing you could perhaps play around with if you're building this sound for yourself. So let's set that up on one of our macros. We'll just set it up on macro 1. And you can hear now macro 1 is controlling. If macro 1's all the way down, our envelope is where we set it at. If I turn macro 1 up, I'm increasing this value here. We could rename this filter DnB amount, for example. And then the last thing I'll say is, because a lot of these chords in drum and bass are often sampled and played back with samplers, another thing we could do is add an insert effect here. Let's perhaps change our insert effect to, if we go to distortion, we can use the bit crusher to emulate a little bit of a vintage sampler feel if we bring the bit depth down to 12 bits. Let's turn this on. You can hear it's pretty aggressive, so I might actually bring the dry wet mix down just to kind of blend that effect in very slightly. You can hear all that high aliasing, those weird high frequencies that get added to the sound. Gives it a little bit of a vintage sampler feel. Not 100% necessary because the sound is pretty clean in the reference song, but it's going to be a fun thing to add and play around with. Filter envelope amount macro. You could also map that to the mod wheel if you wanted to and manipulate that with your MIDI controller. So that's pretty much the sound right there. I hope that all made sense. I hope you learned something about Anna 2 or synthesis in general. And I look forward to catching you guys again real soon on another Get This Sound video. Take care.